Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, our guest is Ian Bremmer. He's a familiar face on the global stage, providing political risk assessment. He's the founder of Eurasia Group, G0 Media, and author of several books. He's also credited for helping to create Wall Street's first global political risk index, bringing the craft of political risk to financial markets. There's probably not been a time since the Second World War when the markets pay as much attention to geopolitical tensions as the other economic risks. So let's hear Ian's analysis. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, good to be with you.
You must be very busy these days. Let's start with Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen's visit with the U.S. House Speaker McCarthy last week. Was it a big deal? China's response has been relatively muted compared to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Why is that? And just overall, why is the growing U.S.-Taiwan coziness?
Well, let's be clear. If you want to talk about what's making U.S. news vis-a-vis China in the last week, it was the McCarthy meeting. But on the global stage, there were lots of things that were more important. I would argue that the decision of the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers to come to Beijing and move forward that peace deal that's been brokered by China, that's more important. The trip of the French president, Emmanuel Macron, as well as Ursula von der Leyen to Beijing, and particularly Macron's comments to try to limit the level of dependence of France and the EU on the United States, while he was certainly leaning into his relationship with China. That's more important. And in some ways, even the trip of former President Ma to mainland China, which is the first trip of a existing or former head of state for Taiwan since the end of the Civil War in 1949 to mainland China. I would say all of these things are more important than the meeting of President Tsai with McCarthy, and the fact that it happened in the U.S., that McCarthy backed away from a trip to Taipei, and then the fact that the Chinese were much more incremental in the escalation that they took diplomatically, economically, and militarily to response compared to what they did when Speaker Pelosi made that trip last year. I think all of those things make the point that a lot is happening on the global stage right now, and the Americans aren't driving as much as they used to.
And why did you say all these things were more important? However, that meeting did get more coverage in the U.S. media.
Well, the Americans, of course, are very, very focused on an American-centric perspective. And that's not what you're asking me about. But since, you're living in Washington and I'm living in New York City, we read the headlines. And the journalists that have been asking me about Beijing this week overwhelmingly have been asking me about the McCarthy meeting, the Tsai trip. So, they just don't move as fast as the world moves. Yeah, go ahead.
That's an excellent point. And so I do want to ask you, what is your assessment of current U.S. policy toward China, despite all the media frenziness about Taiwan-China tensions? Do you think the competition, or the so-called competition that the U.S. and China have right now, can the U.S. win in the long run, or is it the U.S. fighting its own declining global leadership?
I think it's a more complicated question than that. The United States is obviously the dominant security power in the world. There's no other country in the world that can project its military power to every region. Its soldiers, its sailors, its military equipment. The U.S. is also by far the leading arms exporter in the world, and that gap is only growing. But economically, the world is not a U.S.-led unipolar world. China's likely to become the largest economy in the world in 2030. And the EU is the world's largest common market, and they set a lot of the rules and standards. If you want to do business there, you've got to align with their regulatory superpower. The United States has the global reserve currency and the most powerful banking institutions. India is becoming more important. Japan is still playing a big role on the global economic stage. So the economic order is very much a multipolar order. Now then you have the technology questions, and there's a big fight because, of course, the most important technology companies in the world are based in the US and China, but that doesn't mean that they're politically aligned with the United States and China. Many of those companies just want to be global. They just want to make money. And it's not clear how that is playing out yet. And it's also not clear how much decoupling will take place between the United States and China when we talk about data and surveillance capitalism, when we talk about infrastructure and building out new smart grids and the rest. I mean, that's very much a question that's being discussed and debated on a daily basis. But one thing that is very clear, actually two things. The first is that there is a floor under the US-China relationship. And that's not just because Biden and Xi Jinping want there to be a floor, but also because these two countries need each other economically. There's massive interdependence. US-Chinese trade today is at record levels. It's never been higher. You wouldn't know that from all the press coverage, but it's true. Secondly, there are no countries in the world other than the US and China that are pushing for a strong decoupling. Other countries want to be much more hedged. They don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. Canada and Mexico may have no choice because they're so integrated with the US. Cambodia and Laos may have no choice because they're so integrated with mainland China. But for everybody else, they want a balance. And that also helps to ensure you don't have a Cold War, because you can't very well have a Cold War if there's only two countries that are playing. Right. I mean, that's a significant point to recognize, too. So I do think that the coverage that you get in the United States does over exaggerate the level of tension, the level of confrontation, and also the level of importance of the US-China bilateral relationship.
Well, that's why you also mentioned that France Macron visit to Beijing, right? Basically, they put on very pleasant imagery with China's Xi Jinping's meeting. And then he asked Europe to resist pressure to become America's followers. Do you think the US is shooting its own foot by forcing the allies to pick a side?
Well, I don't think the US is forcing the allies to pick a side. I think that they're pressuring the allies using a dominant national security position to define more of the economy through a national security lens. If you've got a hammer, lots of things look like a nail. And so you see that on semiconductors, you see it on 5G, you see it in critical minerals, and indeed you've seen some alignment from the Japanese, from the South Koreans, from the Dutch, for example. And France is resisting that. Now, you didn't ask me about what Macron said about Taiwan, where he said very specifically that this isn't Europe's fight. Taiwan's not Europe's fight. Of course, he didn't say that Ukraine isn't America's fight, and he could have said that, but he didn't, because he doesn't want that hypocrisy to be made clear. And he's representing France and nobody else, and that's unfortunate, but it's true. But what Macron said publicly is not so different from what many European leaders have been saying privately. I think that Macron's trip to China was very successful. It advanced a lot of French national interests, certainly on the economic side, on the commercial side. What was unfortunate is that he needed to open his mouth about it, that he needed to, try to score some points as the erstwhile leader of Europe on the plane on the way back. And he's made mistakes like that before. I think it comes from a very strong, a very healthy sense of self, even in the context of French politicians.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Basically, you think he actually misspoke, that it wasn't an intentional.
Oh, no. I think he said what he meant to say. I just think he shouldn't have said it. I think that that's who he is. I think he can't help himself. I think he has a misguided sense of importance on the European and global stage. And as a consequence, his diplomacy is frequently immature. I think that he's very, very smart. He's very charismatic. He works very hard. And his trip to China was one of his most successful trips internationally, vastly more successful than his recent failed trip to Africa with former French colonies. That basically embarrassed him at home, and vastly more successful, of course, than all the demonstrations he's dealing with very unpopular efforts to increase the pension age. So, I mean, I think he was doing a good job, and then unfortunately, he just put his foot in it.
Well, I think let's focus on sort of how the world basically has different views of China, right? Over the last 30 years. There are always those who think China is about to explode, given its various domestic challenges, versus those who bet on China's bright future. And that exists different views in terms of in the US and the West as well. And you have argued previously that China's power actually has not peaked. Why? And what are China's strengths, and has the West or the US underestimated China?
Well, I mean, first of all, Taiwanese businesses, of course, are also betting very strongly on China's success. So, I mean, some of the business people that know China the best, that speak the language, have traveled there, have lived there, sometimes have married there, right? I mean, they're betting big on China's future. So what do Taiwanese business leaders know that American policymakers don't? It's a very good question, right? And it's a lack of arrogance. It's the fact that you travel there. It's the fact that you see that this level of human capital, hard work, focus on education, willingness to build out infrastructure, all of these things, technological advances. China doesn't just, yes, there are problems with China ripping off IP and not having rule of law, but China also is developing world-changing companies that are innovating themselves. And anyone that's visited China knows that. Now, the problem is most Americans have never been to China. Most American leaders have never been to China. They don't understand it. China's leaders, I think it's 20% of the top 100 officials that Xi Jinping has appointed have been educated, at least in part, in the United States. Right. So they understand what America gets right, and they learn from the US. But if you and I were to go in the halls of Congress in Washington and ask American elected leaders, what do you think we could learn from China? They'd look at you like an alien. They'd be like, what kind of a question is that? No one asked that question. We're not going to learn anything from the Chinese. Well, that's arrogance. It's misplaced. I understand it. It comes from, living in a very safe part of the world geographically with, Mexico, Canada, and two big oceans as its borders, and most Americans never traveling everywhere. But as China is set to become the largest economy in the world, Americans need to change their perspective, right? I think it's extremely important. And this doesn't mean that China's going to have a century of dominance. I don't believe that at all. There are massive headwinds in China demographically, in terms of their bad corporate debt, not dealing with the real estate bubble, for example, the lack of transparency that can chill innovation and capital movement. I mean, all of these things are real problems, but they're not problems that would make anyone sensible think that China is about to implode. And of course, US policy literature has been littered over the last 40 years with experts failing in their predictions that China was about to fall apart.
Well, you have a special, interesting point of view because you also work with a lot of businesses who do business in China.
Sure.
So what are you hearing? What are their major concerns over this relationship? And is the Taiwan Strait the biggest political risk on their mind? What are you hearing?
I think the biggest risk on their mind is just, twofold. One is external, one is internal. The external risk is just how much there is bipartisan agreement that beating up on China is a good idea politically. So not just in areas where there are national security concerns, like dual use semiconductors that have military capabilities, but even things like the Trump tariffs, which only hurt American consumers and which you could easily remove in reciprocal fashion, but it's politically undoable because that would make you look, God forbid, soft on China. And the same thing was true with shooting down the balloon, which Biden had no intention of doing. The Secretary of State was still going to meet with Xi Jinping, but as soon as it became public, then they had to take a tough line, right? Pelosi, Biden trying to convince her not to go, delay the trip. As soon as it gets leaked to the Financial Times, oh no, we want her to make the trip. We're going to be supportive. So there's that. There's the performative aspect of a hard line on anything involving China, on treating China as the enemy, as opposed to a country that is sometimes an adversary, sometimes a competitor, and sometimes a friend. And that reality, that gap in the United States absolutely concerns investors that are doing business in China and might want to do more. And then you have the concerns about doing business in China itself, the political environment, the fact that Jack Ma was persona non grata and now he's okay. A whole bunch of people have been arrested. A lot of billionaires have suddenly disappeared. We don't know where they are. Is that okay? Are the rules going to suddenly change? You can't, use the video games for more than 2 hours a week if you're under 18. Suddenly, decision made by the Chinese government. Well, how can you be in that industry if such? I mean, just these zero COVID and then maximum COVID, very sudden change that the Chinese, government officials at the regional level, the provincial level aren't prepared for. So I think the level of opacity, the lack of clarity in rules of the road in China are also chilling American investment and other investments as well from other countries around the world. And when you put those two things together, I would say that a large number of CEOs I talked to who 3 years ago, 5 years ago, would have considered China to be one of their most important, if not most important, growth markets for future investment are now taking a pause. They're being much more cautious about how much capital they want to allocate because they see increased risk. They see that they're not necessarily being rewarded for those investments.
Well, given what you mentioned as the first part, there's so much performance sort of politics in the United States toward China right now. What would be your advice to the Taiwanese government? Because there's also a debate in Taiwan whether Taiwan should trust the U.S., side with the U.S., or they should diversify and try to talk to China and to secure a more peaceful agreement. So I guess the question is, should Taiwan put all its eggs in the U.S. market?
Well, I think first of all, the United States is not just the United States. South Korea and Japan now have finally a more constructive bilateral relationship that will include sharing of intelligence, military exercises. They're ending their export controls, the Japanese on South Korea. That's very helpful for Taiwan. So if you're Taiwan and you're working with the US, you're also working with South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. That's very important that the Taiwanese are not alone in the Asian environment geopolitically and geoeconomically. At the same time, Taiwan is overwhelmingly economically integrated with and dependent on mainland China, and that's not going to change. So I think living with that reality means that if you are Taiwan, the status quo works for you. You don't want the status quo changed. And that's why I think it was sensible for the president of Taiwan to push McCarthy not to make a trip to Taipei, because the only one that's going to pay for that trip are the Taiwanese people, yes. Right? It's just going to hurt the Taiwanese economically, politically, and militarily. So why would you do that? In other words, do not provoke China unnecessarily. And that means if you are thinking about the upcoming Taiwanese election, and you're, in the DPP, you don't want to be making strong statements about independence that the Chinese will react to very strongly. You want to continue to push hard to maintain the status quo. Now, the challenge that Taiwan is going to have, not to mention the fact that China is getting more powerful in the region, and you've got Macron and others that are questioning, is also that TSMC is becoming politicized. It's the most strategically important company in the world. It's absolutely indispensable for semiconductors. The Americans are saying that they want TSMC to be a strategic and defense partner of the United States and its allies, which means that they will no longer be providing the same level of support for exports to mainland China. Now, if you're China and you hear that, you're saying, well, we're going to have to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in our own semiconductor industry, making TSMC obsolete. And now if Taiwan goes from TSMC is the most important strategic company in the world for both mainland China and the US to TSMC has to put fabs in the United States and its allies that are high performance, and that China's going to build their own, well, suddenly the status quo has been changed in ways that make Taiwan much more vulnerable to economic and military escalation. And so it is strongly not in Taiwan's interest to have the status quo of TSMC changed, either by the Americans or by the Chinese. This is a big problem in my view.
Well, I think that concern is legitimate for a lot of people who care about semiconductor sort of hollowing out effect in Taiwan. But there's also some argument that, China has been investing in the semiconductor sector for years and hasn't been successful. I don't know if you have any insights or insider scoop in terms of how well advanced they can be, or this is truly an advantage that Taiwan or the West has.
It is an advantage that Taiwan and the West has right now. And the question is, will they have it in 10 years? Because as I'm sure you know, China has managed to gain parity, and in some cases are well ahead of the Americans in advanced technology. Certainly in the digital economy, that's true. In facial recognition, in voice recognition, I would say in the creation of the infrastructure for smart cities, and in generative artificial intelligence, the Chinese are not far behind, maybe 6, maybe 12 months. On semiconductors, they're very far behind, like 3 generations. So the question is, the Americans are making a big bet, not just by trying to invest more in the US through the CHIPS Act, but also through these export controls.
Yes.
The Americans are trying to contain the Chinese and keep them down in semiconductor advancement. And will that work over the next 5 to 10 years? Can the Americans win on semiconductors and therefore maintain an advantage, a critical advantage, in the commanding heights of the 21st century economy? And the answer, Wenqi, is that we don't know. The answer is we don't know. If you made me bet, I would bet that the Americans would maintain a more significant lead through this policy than otherwise, but I don't have high confidence on that. I think there's at least a 20% chance that this policy fails completely, and that the Chinese are able to invest and become the technology superpower because the Chinese government's driving it. They're making the investments. There are far more people with far more data, no privacy, all consolidated in a small number of super apps. And they're just able to drive advances that are critical in next generation AI in the way that the Americans and the Europeans and others end up being behind. And what I'm suggesting is that the bet that's being made right now by the United States might be one of the most consequential geopolitical bets that have been ever made. And it's being made without a lot of certainty on the outcome.
Well, I think regardless, you have to credit the Biden administration for at least trying rather than not taking any action. And so what are the
question.
other...
Why would you necessarily say that? Because I could argue, I happen to think it's an interesting bet. I think that there's a strong argument to be made that not making that bet if you're suggesting that bet that the Chinese level of investment would be exactly the same irrespective. That, I guess that's an interesting point. I'm not sure that's what you're arguing.
Yeah, because I think there is a lot of concern about inaction rather than, and that's sort of, at least during the Obama administration, a lot of people feel that there was too much inaction when it comes to with China. And so that's the lost time. And my observation is that this administration is trying to show that it's trying to change the trajectory where, the China is headed or the US is headed. So my sense is that they would rather be credited for making decisions and taking actions, even if they fail, rather than sitting there and not
Yeah,
doing
I mean, of course, you could make that argument for Bush invading Iraq, and I hope you wouldn't. But let me put it this way: my view on this is that the Biden decision to invest substantially in U.S. infrastructure, in U.S. semiconductors, in U.S. critical minerals and transition on the energy front, overwhelmingly smart, overdue thing to do. I think that's a question where action is much, much better than inaction. The U.S. has kicked the can on that for a long time. I think the question of U.S. export controls against China is not necessarily a clear win for the U.S. It clearly leads to a lot of backlash by, for example, Macron and other Europeans. It potentially could break the transatlantic relationship in a way that it's been very aligned after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. That's important. It could also lead to much stronger Chinese decision to itself go down a more self-sufficient and more decoupled path. Certainly, when I see Kristalina Georgiev at the IMF in this week's spring meetings, taking a full percentage point off of her global growth expectations, that's in large part because of where she sees globalization going, where she sees the U.S.-China relationship going. So she's clearly structurally very concerned, as are her economists. So I have a mixed view on what this policy is or is not going to achieve.
Understandable. And I do think there's different political considerations, especially domestically speaking, for them or this administration trying to win elections. That's another factor. But anyway, moving on, because we have very limited time. What are the other major political risks that deserve more attention, but that are not on people's radar now?
Well, Russia's on people's radar, but it's massive because people are talking about Ukraine. But the fact that Russia has become a rogue state for the entire West, we saw this big intelligence leak that came out, and one piece that was quite concerning was how close a British spy plane was to being shot down over the Black Sea by the Russians. And I mean, if that had happened, you might have had direct warfare in response from the United States, from the UK, from NATO against Russia. We have to understand this is not just a Cold War with Russia. This is a hot war by proxy. That is certainly the way the Russians see it, and it has the potential to spill over into more direct confrontation with NATO. This is the dangerous environment. We've been most dangerous since 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, I'm not talking about nuclear warfare. I don't think the Russians are going to use a nuke against Ukraine, thank God. But I am talking about spillover, horizontal spillover of the war beyond Ukraine into NATO itself. And we need to understand just how likely that potential is, not just this year, but going forward, as Putin is in a corner, as Putin has no way back to where he was. His assets are frozen. His gas is stranded. He can't build his military back the way it was. I mean, and NATO has expanded. I mean, these are all fundamental points for a G20 economy and one of the biggest militaries in the world. And the West is basically at war with it. I mean, once you've called a leader a war criminal, you can't sit down. Think about the other people that have been called war criminals: Milosevic, Bashir, Gaddafi. These are generally people that end up in jail or dead. And the Americans don't have that option when it comes to Putin. But it's a very scary place to be. So, by far, that's the real uncertainty that could go boom in very short order.
So then what are your top three predictions in the next 18 months or so in the world, from Russia-Ukraine war to global recession or Donald Trump being reelected US president?
Well, I would say that even if we talk a lot less about Ukraine in 18 months, we're going to talk more about Russia. So Russia is going to be much more of a danger as the most powerful rogue state on the global stage for the West that we've seen in history. That's number one. Number two, I think Trump will probably get the nomination, and that means that the 2020 for the GOP, which means the GOP will have to align underneath him. And that means that the 2024 presidential election will be every bit as divisive, maybe more so than 2020. And the Americans the impact of that on the way other countries look at the United States and the level of consistency of U.S. policy, commitment of U.S. policy, I think will be open to question once again. And then third, I do think that China's influence on the stage, the global stage diplomatically, is going to continue to grow, particularly in the Middle East, where the Chinese are starting to displace the Americans. We will see. I think it's going to be hard for the Europeans to maintain the same level of unity on Russia while they're trying to hedge on China. And that, where those two things come together, are going to be very interesting.
Well, thank you, Ian, for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room and giving us your global risk assessment.
My pleasure.
Take good care.
You too.
All right. You think Donald